Jewish Leadership Academy to give us some opening remarks.
Hey, thank you, Heather. Good Wednesday afternoon to everyone. At least I think it.
Oh,
It's Wednesday.
Alan, wait a second, you're muted. Jody, can you unmute him?
I can't find him. Hold on.
Okay, wait, I got it.
There he
Can you hear
is.
me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so again, good Wednesday afternoon to everyone. I just confirmed it is Wednesday, so that's a good thing. And welcome to our Jewish Leadership Academy session today, presented by Dirk, entitled COVID-19 and Nonprofits, What is the New Normal? We hope everyone is well and staying safe at this time. Just a couple of comments to thank our sponsors, which has been developed with the support of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford and funded by the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford, the Arbach Shiro Foundation, the Samuel Roskin Fund Trust at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Leah and Richard Rubenstein, Lisa and Peter Fishman, Sandy and Arnie Deshevsky, and Howard and Patty Weiner. During this workshop today, we're going to discuss how to prepare for the new normal and develop frameworks that will enable us to think through the challenges in a thoughtful and proactive manner. Following Dirk's presentation, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers. We're pleased to have Dirk Bird with us today on this Zoom meeting. He is the Associate Vice President of Planned Giving and Endowment for Jewish Federations of North America, JFNA, and is a member of JFNA's Community Consulting Team. Dirk has spent nearly 20 years working as a development professional and has vast experience with many forms of philanthropy and philanthropic planning. So we're welcoming Dirk. Hopefully he's with us now. Yes?
I am very much with you. It's good to see everybody again.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see some familiar faces. The last official community visit that I made prior to the world changing was in Hartford at the very end of February to do the last Leadership Academy class. And so it's wonderful seeing all of you. Thank you for bringing me back to have a conversation. And that's what I hope this will be today. I want to encourage you to use the chat function of Zoom. I know that we're now all Zoom experts. So if you'll use the chat function as you have questions, to share ideas, to share your struggles. I am a firm believer in collective expertise. I have a particular viewpoint that has been informed by 20 years of doing this work. I believe there are probably 40 people on this call. I'm going to guess there's an average experience level of at least 10 years in community. So as a collective, we have several hundred years of experience, insights, and valuable things to share as we all deal with this new reality in which we're living. And I want to just start by saying that I've been on a number of calls over the course of the last 6 weeks with Jewish communities across the continent, with groups of professionals, with group of lay leaders. I've been privy to some conversations that have taken place outside of the Federation system, JCCA world, and others. And this is hard. This is real. It's impacting all of us in different ways, and there is no clear roadmap for this. And I want to say that up front because I think it's important for us to not only keep that in mind, as though we're not constantly reminded of that, but for us to have patience with ourselves. Patience with ourselves as leaders, patience with ourselves as constituents and stakeholders of organizations that we're trying to figure this out on the fly. And things keep evolving and changing. And what we thought was true one day is murky the next. So I wanted to just call that out up front because I think that's important to acknowledge. So just a little bit about structure. Again, please use the chat function to ask questions. I want to leave ample time at the end of this to have you ask questions, share some of what you've seen, share some of what you've learned already that may influence your strategy going forward, because that information share, that dialogue that we start here, that may lend itself to future conversations. And I would be happy to come back, Heather and Jody, if you're on the call, if there are other topics that we want to explore, because there may be things that you unearth that require a deeper exploration. So please use the chat function for that. I'll take about 20-ish minutes or so to run through some basic frameworks to answer the big questions that we want to throw out there. And then we'll leave the time at the end for Q&A. Heather, Jody, Alan, anything that you want to mention before we dive into this?
I
We
think
good?
you're good to go.
Okay, great. So as we discussed at the very beginning, this workshop will try to explore how organizations and their leaders are adjusting to this new normal. It will impact how we plan, how we engage with our constituents, how we steward our donors, how we measure success while trying to maintain and possibly re-articulate our core values as an organization. And that values theme is something we're going to talk about throughout this morning. We'll discuss how to prepare for the new normal and develop frameworks that will hopefully enable us to think through these challenges in a thoughtful, proactive manner. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is hard. This is really hard work. And that's why I am a firm believer in collective expertise and coming together collectively to share, because we can all use outside perspectives during this time. And we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. What others are doing, what others are putting into practice, what they're learning can benefit all of us. It may not have the same direct application to our work, but if we can come together and share and understand what others are doing and adapt that to our work, we will all be better off as an organized community. So this session will explore planning, communication, engagement. I know broadly defined, so it's different constituencies, engagement with our stakeholders, our volunteers, our donors, our families, our parents, our students. I know that there is a constellation of organizations that are represented on this call. We all have different constituents with whom we engage. Management. How do we manage? How do we manage our professional teams? How do we as professionals take into context the different realities that our colleagues and our peers are dealing with? And how do we as lay leaders support our professionals and understand a little bit about some of the unique management challenges that we may be facing during this time? Metrics. How do we measure success? What is that based on? How do we establish priorities, and how do we know if the work that we're actually doing is making an impact, is successful? We had metrics previous, whether they were an event and 400 people came and 300 people gave, and we had follow-up conversations with 14 people. Some of those same ways of engaging and measuring our success, they're no longer within our reach right now. So how do we frame things in a different context and develop new ways of measuring the impact of our work? How do we use our core organizational values to inform our process, decision-making, priority setting, multiple phases of response? Because I think as we're seeing, we may be somewhat emerging from the triage, immediate response to this crisis. And now we're starting to understand the ongoing ripple effect of what this crisis is bringing. And that's likely to come in waves. There is a next wave coming as we see the rolling cancellation of summer camps. And what does that mean for our institution? And we'll have the future waves of ongoing workforce stabilization, operating capital for our institutions, the need for the expansion of mental health services, the likely increase in requests for tuition assistance, scholarships, and many, many more things that we're already starting to see. How are we planning for that? How are we planning for a reality where we may not be able to do direct engagement of our key stakeholders until sometime in 2021? How are we planning to replace the events on which we rely with other forms of engagement, either smaller group engagement or leveraging technology? So how are we using frameworks to think through some of this? In addition, we want to also explore some basic guiding principles for the rest of the day. I really want you to be curious, and I want you to ask hard questions because I want us to wrestle with that together. I also want you to share. If you've seen things that have worked for you thus far, that's important information. So I just wanted to stress those points again. So the macro questions. How can we prepare and anticipate the new normal? How have our constituents' needs changed? And when we look at the people that we serve, people that we engage, donors, parents, students, other constituents, how have their needs changed? And how does that impact our ability to serve those needs? And how does it impact our mission? So the first thing we want to start with is decision-making and planning. What informs our decision-making? What do we use to create a framework for this? And why is the differentiation important between what do we know now and what is still unclear? So let me expand on that a little bit. So in terms of what we know now, there's a lot that we don't know. But there are a few things that we can wrestle with that might be clear. One of which is to be honest about the challenges that existed prior to this current crisis that have been either revealed or exacerbated. So to understand what is the result of the crisis and what existed before. That's really important to wrestle with and to have honest conversations about, because it would be understandable and easy to fall back into, well, crisis created this and it was only because of the crisis. The reality is, for many of our organizations, we had challenges and struggles prior to this. And so how do we deal with that in the new reality? And so differentiating between those two things is critically important. And acknowledging what we don't know. And I think that this is where being honest with ourselves internally and being honest with our stakeholders about the things that are outside of our control. We can't get into the business of trying to predict the future. We can only create structures where we gather information, where we learn from others, where we come together to share ideas, but we can't yet predict the future. And I think acknowledging that, and from what I've seen as other communities and other institutions have created frameworks, that's a critical piece of this. Because sometimes we fool ourselves into knowing more than we really do, and that could have a detrimental impact on our ability to continue to shift and to pivot as this evolves. So remaining humble in what we don't know is really, really important. When we think about the decision-making and the planning and thinking through this, the first place I always come back to, and I talked about this when I was there in February, is anything that we do organizationally, anything that we're preparing for, anything that we're struggling with, challenged by, come back to our core values. How are we using our core values organizationally as guide? And each institution, organization has a set of core values, whether they're stated and they're public or they're known internally, that we use to guide our decision making. Always start here. And so this might be a good time to go back and re-articulate what those core values are, not only for the purpose of making decisions, but also communicating to your stakeholders. These are our values that we hold true. Our values remain constant. The situation around us may have changed, but our values may remain constant. They're our foundation. These are what ground us. So not only having that conversation internally, but communicating what your core values are as a piece of decision-making is a really critical step, because those values will help us to set priorities, will guide our stakeholder engagement, and will guide communication. after we reconnect ourselves with our values and have that conversation, we also need to be mindful of what is our mindset going into a response to crisis. I think that we've seen organizations that are open, authentic, and honest about what we know and what we don't, what we can control and what we can't control. They tend to fare a lot better than those organizations who remain closed in their decision-making process, who try to control that which is not controllable, and have a very small group of people making the decisions. So the mindset of openness, of seeing honesty and authenticity as strength, and part of that means we have to be somewhat vulnerable. And vulnerable can sometimes be perceived as a weakness. That's one of the myths of vulnerability. It's actually a great strength. We feel vulnerability during times of risk and uncertainty and emotional exposure. And I think all of us, in a certain way, are feeling vulnerable. So acknowledge that. Acknowledge that we don't know everything. Be honest in your communication and be consistent. That mindset of being okay with vulnerability will allow us to communicate and engage with our key stakeholders in a much more authentic, honest, human way. Management. So I know that we have a mix of professionals and lay leaders on this call. So I want to speak to both sides of this particular issue. So our organizations right now have done, I believe, a remarkable job of moving from a more traditional work environment to a virtual work environment. Many organizations did so within a matter of just a few days. And so we should take the time to acknowledge that, to thank our lay leaders and our professionals for making that pivot, because it's allowed us to continue to do some of what we've done before. It's definitely in a different way, but that pivot is critically important to acknowledge. The piece that I've observed from my conversations with federations and other institutions is that there are certain unique challenges that we're facing that are unlike normal remote work structures. Each one of us has a different context for the environment that we're working under. All of us are impacted in a certain way. So how are we understanding this context for the people who work with us? How are we soliciting that feedback? For many of our employees, many of our professionals, they may be in situations where they are working from home while their children are at home. They may be working in a situation where they're also trying to care for an elderly parent or an elderly relative. They may be in a situation where they're now living in a house of three generations, because this crisis has forced relocations, movements, and I've had multiple conversations of parents, grandparents, and grandchildren all living under one environment. So how does that affect their ability and their availability to work? How does that affect their ability to be part of a process? How are we giving them the space and the understanding that they may not be as available, so that the morale of our professionals who are doing this work and the morale of our lay leaders? The same is true for our lay leadership. Our lay leaders are our parents, their grandparents, their children. They have unique realities as well. So that constant communication and understanding of that dynamic is really important, and acknowledging that even as our counties and our states start to open back up, that until we have a child care solution, that dynamic is not going to go away, especially for those working parents. So that is going to be an ongoing challenge that we have to be aware of. I think the other piece too, from a management standpoint, and this speaks to our lay leadership, is how are we leveraging the skills and expertise of our lay leaders as we think through challenges, understanding who on our boards run businesses, have managed operations, have participated in crisis response, understand communication, really understanding the unique skill sets of our lay leaders, and then asking them for help as we respond to this crisis, deploying them in a thoughtful way based on the unique skill sets that they bring to the organization. This isn't something we do always as a matter of course, but I do believe that there's a unique opportunity to take a different look at the resources available to us through our lay leadership. I also, from a management and decision-making standpoint, how are we seeking the counsel of others? How are we seeking the counsel of our community partners? How are we reaching out as professionals to our professional colleagues? How are we as lay leaders reaching out to our lay peers? What are we using to learn on an ongoing basis from the experience of others, both within the context of our own community as well as outside of? Because again, this is not a Jewish community issue. This is a broad, pervasive issue that all communities are facing, and who are our natural partners to learn from in those communities. Just as an anecdote, I think what I've observed from a decision-making process, from an engagement process internally with key lay leadership and professionals, is that some organizations have created additional damage by not being clear on how decisions are made and not engaging key professionals or lay leaders in strategic decisions where that lay leader or that professional may actually be the closest to the constituency that decision impacts. We have people in our organizations who understand our external stakeholders in a different, unique way. And a lot of our decisions are impacting how we engage all of our stakeholders, our families, our parents, our donors. How are we engaging the subject matter experts in our own organizations to influence and inform our decisions, and not just have a small group make decisions in an echo chamber? Right now is not the time to close those ranks. Now is the time to seek counsel from the people within our organizations who understand how we serve our unique and diverse constituency base. The other piece that I've seen from organizations is going back to our values and really using our values to establish priorities. What are our priorities now organizationally? And many of our organizations have gone through a process where during the first weeks of this crisis, they established very clear priorities around how are we responding today? What are the needs of our constituency base today? How are we prioritizing who we serve and how we serve them? That is starting to evolve. So many organizations are now going back to look at priorities, and they're measuring them in longer term, but still relatively short. How do we, over the next 6 to 12 months, what are our priorities? What are we anticipating the needs of our community changing? What's the criteria that we're using to make decisions? And I think that's a piece that is, I've seen too many organizations get tripped up on the criteria. If you don't have clear criteria for how decisions are made, then it's very easy for you to subject yourself to unnecessary and undue criticism. It's not so much the decision itself. We all have to make very difficult decisions, and many of our organizations have already taken steps to do so. Reductions in force, furloughs, budgetary cuts, other measures that they've had to do by force because of the situation. That's not the issue. It's how they made those decisions. Internal prioritization and the criteria that they used, and how that priority and how that criteria gets communicated. When you hear of an action or you hear of a decision, oftentimes the human response is to ask, well, why? Why did they do that? What led them to make that decision? What were the conditions under which they were operating? What was the information that they were using? And in the absence of that, oftentimes, far too often, that vacuum gets filled. That vacuum gets filled by misinformation, interpretation. We open ourselves up to all sorts of distraction and challenge by the simple fact that we don't share how we make our decisions. It doesn't mean that the decision itself is going to be met with open arms by everybody. It's not. These are difficult times and we're making difficult decisions. But we do ourselves a disservice when we don't share how we're making decisions with our constituency. And we'll come back to that a little bit, I think, in the Q&A, because I think that's a critically important piece to understand from the communication standpoint. And again, from an information, we don't have to hold ourselves to the standard of having all of the information before we make decisions. In fact, no one right now has all of the information that they would like to have to make these decisions. It's not achievable. It's not possible. So there's a basic understanding, I think, and some empathy from our constituencies to know that our organizations are dealing with bits and pieces of information at best. The other piece that I think is important, and I actually will get to this a little bit later, but I want to call it out now because I think it's the other side of this coin, is not only communicating to our constituency base how we make decisions, communicating how we are getting feedback and how we're learning from the experience of pivoting, how we're learning from the decisions we made, because that feedback loop is really critical. Because if we make a decision, strategy, priority, criteria, whatever it happens to be, but yet we don't take the time to learn from that decision, there's no feedback loop, there's no means by which to gather information in terms of, is this thing making an impact? Then that's a missed opportunity, because that's also an important piece to communicate to donors, parents, children, all of our key stakeholders around, here's what we're doing, and here's how we plan to learn and gather information from the steps we've taken. And I'm sure that all of you, or many of you, have already seen and heard, based on decisions you've made organizationally, to pivot to a new way of engaging folks on Zoom, or pivot the way you're communicating. You've gotten response and feedback already that will inform your strategy going forward. And one of the things I want to get to when we get to the Q&A piece is I'd love to hear from organizations and hear from you, what have you done that's already working, and not just working now, but maybe working well into the future. There are positive outcomes of what we're dealing with that may influence how we work, how we engage, and how we communicate, and that's a really important piece. So that feedback loop, building that into our decision-making process, critically important. Communication. So we're all trying to figure out how to communicate broadly with our different groups, frequency, messaging, format, all of the vehicles that we have at our disposal. There is not a lack of communication taking place. However, what I've seen and what I've heard from the different groups that I've been a part of, the different trainings that I've been a part of, the communities that I've talked to, and I've probably talked to no less than 70 Jewish communities in the last 3 weeks, that they're seeing a desire for more content, for more gathering, for more information, access to information, briefings from key professionals, briefings from agency and organizational partners. Anything that you can provide as a forum for gathering has largely been perceived as a positive. Anytime you can provide an opportunity to brief your key stakeholders on all of these things, how you're making decisions, what your core values are, how you've pivoted, what you're seeing and anticipating for the next 6 to 12 months, that content is critical. The opposite is also true. When we don't communicate and we have gaps in the information that we're providing to our key stakeholders, that also sends a message. It sends a message of, we may not know. We're stuck. We don't value your engagement in this process. And that's not by design, but when there are vacuums, we fill those with the interpretations. And that's often the interpretation that we're left with is, they're not communicating, they don't know what to do, they're struggling, they don't value me, whatever it happens to be. So please, please continue to communicate with your key stakeholders as you evolve in your organizational practice and your decision making. So just a couple more points I want to make before we get to the Q&A. I think from a communication standpoint, transparency and clarity, critically important. Authenticity, empathizing with your donors, with your families, with your students, with the people that you serve, that again, this is hard. You can talk about the work that you're doing and talk about the important mission you're serving, at the same time acknowledging that there is difficulty still ahead, that we are going to continue to face challenges, and that it may get bumpy, and the next couple of years are likely to be difficult. There's a fear in doing that sometimes of creating more panic, but I think that's a real human emotion that we're all feeling right now. And we actually develop and engender more of a stronger connection with all the people we're communicating with. We're honest about the situation in front of us. Again, we talked about the consistency in communication, and we have different channels for broad communication. One of the things that I would encourage you to continue to do, and I've seen that many organizations have done with either donors, key stakeholders, so current board members and committee members, past board members, parents, is that individual outreach is paramount. We can have Zoom gatherings, we can have broad-based communication, marketing messages, all of which is important, but the individual outreach to the people who support us, the people who believe in us, the people who share our values around our mission and the impact of our mission, that ongoing piece was taking place in the early days of how are you doing? Is your family healthy? Are you safe? What do you need? Don't stop that. Absolutely do not stop that. These are the relationships that we're developing by having an intimate conversation and engagement with our key stakeholders during this time is going to pay dividends for us down the road. But that also has to be consistent because this is evolving. What may have been real for one of our key stakeholders a couple of weeks ago may have changed dramatically just in the last few weeks and may change again dramatically in the fall. So that stewardship, that authentic, real, human, personal engagement of the people who support us is absolutely paramount. And it's a great opportunity for both lay leaders and professionals to serve in that capacity. Our professionals and our lay leaders should have the opportunity to reach out and have a human engagement with the people who support you. And it doesn't have to be anything other than, how are you doing? I wanted to check in. Here's what we're seeing and what we're doing. Thank you so much for your support of our organization. And that support can be financial. That support can be their having sent their children to a school. That support can be the advocacy that they've demonstrated over the years. Whatever that support means, letting them know that their time and energy and resources is making a meaningful difference today and throughout this crisis will strengthen those relationships. That stewardship piece is really important, and I've seen communities benefit greatly from that, not only in terms of the relationships, but also for our professionals and our lay leaders. We may be struggling with the value that we bring to organizations because our traditional roles may look very different than they did before the beginning of this crisis. We may not know necessarily how to apply our skills and our expertise because we don't have the same access and outlets for that. This is a way for us as humans to be part of that, for us to be part of that engagement, for us to do something positive for organizations when we may feel at times powerless as individuals to do something positive. So that's a critical piece from a morale standpoint for both professionals and lay leaders. The other piece around communication, this is the last piece that I'll share, is that oftentimes it reduces the stress and the anxiety from knowing that there is some sort of a plan, that the organization has a vision for how it's moving forward, that the organization has priorities and established criteria. The not knowing is the harder part. And even if we don't have all the details, simply communicating that there is a plan in place, that we're thinking through these things, that's a critical piece. We also have the opportunity to reframe the importance of our work. And so when we talked at the very beginning around our values and asking the question of how have the needs of our donors, of our constituents, of our students, of our parents, how have they changed? Acknowledging that through our communication, talking through how we've pivoted to address those needs is really critical, because what we're all wrestling with now is what is the importance of our work going forward? And hopefully for many of us, we realize that our work at its core, based on our mission and based on our values, will be even more important, because we serve a critical service to not only our Jewish communities, but to the greater world, because of the gathering that we do. And so how do we do that in a different way? And again, creating an opportunity for people to ask questions of leaders. I think these Zoom forums, these opportunities to come together, those have been really important, because it gives people opportunity to ask those questions that others may be thinking as well, and have been too shy or haven't been able to access the opportunities to ask leaders the kinds of questions that will help them feel more connected to the organization or a little bit better about the future. So that's a broad overview of some of the things that we're all trying to incorporate as we move forward organizationally. I'd like to go now into the Q&A process and spend the remainder of the time really discussing as a group how we wrestle with these things. So Heather and Jody, I know you're there as well. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat. So as you have other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Also too, if you've experimented or you're already starting to see some positives from pivots you've made organizationally, I'd love for you to include some of that in the chat as well. It's really important, I think, for us to call out and to share as a group. Let's see. I have a question here. With respect to communicating how an organization makes decisions, can you address how leaders should communicate a real-world current decision on reopening offices, re-engaging employees, and our key stakeholders? Fantastic question. And I think that this is a question that all of our organizations, when I say our, I mean human. All of our organizations, institutions, businesses are asking themselves, what's the criteria that we're using to make these decisions? And so I'm very close to someone who's been doing work in the early childhood education space, and childcare is a primary issue that we're facing, not only from a respite standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. It'll be difficult to get the economy going again until we have regular, sustainable childcare. And early childhood care is a big piece of that, and it's a big piece for our Jewish communities. And in the decisions that I've been privy to, and the conversations that I've heard, is using data and using the clear criteria set by our healthcare professionals, by those who are closest to understanding the ramifications for decisions. That's, if we can use that criteria as communities and have a common set of standards that will determine when we reopen, that I believe is a prudent path going forward, because we're not just relying on our own internal decision making. We're relying on the expertise of others. Now, I do realize that there are realities that each one of our institutions are facing, financial and otherwise, and that opening may mean something different for each one of our institutions. And so I would encourage you as much as possible, when you're processing those decisions, to consult with experts in your community around, if we do this, what are the potential outcomes positively, and what are the potential ramifications negatively? What do we need to be prepared for if we open now? What data do we have access to that will influence our decision making? And then communicating that appropriately. It's again, there's no roadmap for this. This is all brand new, and each institution has to establish that criteria. But you'll be in a much stronger position if you're not making those decisions in a closed loop. if you're clearly communicating with experts, not just public health officials, but experts in education, experts in communal gatherings, experts in whatever particular space you serve, so that you're making your decisions in alignment with others. Another question, in reaching out to supporters, is it essential that such contacts be one-on-one by phone versus email with a possible follow-up or a phone conversation before we can meet personally? I think I understand the gist of the question. So I think any form of one-on-one communication now, I have found is greatly appreciated. And I don't know that it matters all that much what the format is. You can't replace human-to-human contact. You can't replace the intimacy of sitting across the table from someone and having a conversation. However, I have found, and I've spoken to a number of lay leaders and professionals who have found that setting up these Zoom calls one-on-one is as close of a replacement as we're going to find right now. And what we're trying to do is steward our relationships, and from a donor standpoint, understand where our donors are in a very human way. Some of our donors, their livelihoods have been impacted, and the future of their businesses, the pressure financially is very much in question. And some have not been as impacted. And some will actually be our partners in marshaling a response, in helping us to create resources and pools of resources to address communal needs on a going forward basis. So as much of those conversations you can have now, whether it's phone or it's Zoom, that will maintain the relationship, one. Communicate how, again, I can't stress this enough. Your mobilization and your ability to respond to crisis and to think through what next steps look like, communicating that to the people who've invested in you over the course of time reinforces that investment. And I don't know that we're connecting those dots often enough in these conversations of really thanking people, not just thanking them in general terms, but specifically around, without your support historically, we would not have the foundation and the infrastructure and the resources to be able to respond to the crisis. Thank you, period. That's where that conversation should begin. It doesn't have to have anything else. It doesn't have to have an ask. It's thank you for investing in us because of you, so that they individually feel as though they're connected to something positive when there are very few outlets to feel that positive. Other questions? Anybody want to share, and you can unmute yourselves, anybody want to share something that you have pivoted to during this time that may be part of your practice going forward? Communication, constituency engagement, donor engagement. I know that we're all thinking about the fall, and we have events typically in the fall, and we may not be able to do those. So how are we thinking through replacing what was typically part of our practice? Any thoughts?
I have something.
Yes, please.
Hi,
Hi, Lisa.
hi. I was reaching out to a person who had called me back about 2 months ago when this all started. He was concerned with everything going on, that he didn't have a grave site set for himself. So I met him virtually. Went on FaceTime. I found a grave for him, and then I found out that he needed food. So I worked with all of the staff at Federation who were organizing that, and immediately got him food. And now he's been receiving it every week, and he's been thrilled. So it was one connection for one reason that turned into something else. And now he has my phone number, and he calls me every week to chat and see how I'm doing, and we catch up. So it's a great relationship.
And thank you for sharing, Lisa. I think that's an important point, is that we may find out things and be prepared and open to understanding what the real human needs are of the people that we work with, the people who support our organizations, our parents in our schools, the children we serve, that we may start as one conversation and end up in a totally different direction. And so when that happens, I think for organizations is how do we have systems so that we can respond? Lisa, you had a system in place because you had resources and networks. For our other organizations, if we have people in our own communities who are in need, are we aware of those networks locally? Who are we connecting them with? How are we reacting when we hear of someone who needs our support and help? Okay, got it. Other thoughts that people would like to share, things that maybe have been surprises as you've moved to a virtual stewardship and a virtual engagement platform, from the response you've gotten from gatherings, from briefings, from outreach to donors or others, things that may have surprised you. Curious. So I'll jump back in. One thing I am seeing is that for communities that have used the Zoom function to provide briefings for donors, for board members, for leadership, it's something that I think many communities have found that this is a great way to gather a larger group of people in a more convenient way than trying to do everything in person. And so some of this gathering may have utility well beyond this crisis, because we can, because of the technology, enable more people to access those resources. And I think and I was thinking about this in conversation with some communities last week, for northern communities, cold weather communities, who have a certain percentage of their population go to warmer weather climates, how are we communicating and staying in contact with those folks who go to the desert, to go to Florida during the winter? How can we use technology like this to stay in contact with them, provide them with content, do donor briefing? Because we have seen that there is a desire for this. What we don't know is that will there be a bounce once we're back to whatever normal looks like? Will people avoid Zoom? I think that there will be an initial reaction to it, but there is utility using this technology on a going forward basis to communicate to broader audiences than we might be able to gather on our own. It's an efficient use of time. The other piece and this is more just purely donor stewardship. So my role at Jewish Federations in North America is to oversee plan giving and endowment. And we've encouraged communities to, in addition to their current major donors, to their board members, to also reach out to those people, those individuals and those families who've created a gift of permanence, who've left bequests, who've left legacy gifts, just to say thank you. Whether it's they've made realized gifts and they're still with us, or they left gifts years and years and years ago, the ripple effect that we're feeling today, reaching out to their family members, just say thank you. Your parent or your grandparents created this endowment. And because they created this endowment, we're able to mobilize and pivot and respond because we have the resources to do so. Thank you. Thank you for that contribution. If people have made through life and legacy programs or other, if they've made commitments to your organization through whatever vehicle, it's a great way to thank them. Thank you for being a part of protecting our future. We don't know what's going to happen. Making that kind of a gift is the ultimate leap of faith. What it demonstrates is that we believe in the future, and we believe that our resources and our gifts will have a ripple effect. And what we're seeing today is absolutely that in real time, is that our organizations who have donors who've left gifts of permanence are well-positioned, they have resources, and they have strong infrastructure. So it's just another piece of stewardship that I think is really important. Let's see if we have other questions here. So we have one, Zoom Hebrew School attendance has been excellent and programming has been welcomed by parents. So I think for some of our institutions, there may be gathering opportunities for us on a going forward basis that may allow a broader response and then a larger number of people to participate. I think the downside, if I'm speaking purely from a student standpoint, is that snow days are a thing of the past. No more snow days, because guess what? We know we can have school or Hebrew school online. So that's the only downside. But as from a parent's perspective, we've also seen it as well, is that we now are seeing kids on the Zoom call for Hebrew school who never attended in person. Just either because of geography, other things. So we are also seeing some positive.
Dirk,
yeah.
can I just say something
Yeah,
on
please.
that point? There's a great article written by my colleague David Breifman that was in the foreword. And what he spoke about was this amazing technology that we now have kind of started to harness, yet it still can't replace that one-to-one in-person interaction. So what we have to figure out now is how do we balance those two so that we're meeting a broad variety of needs?
Well said. I think it becomes part of the mix of the strategy of the different communication channels, because you're right, you can't replace the one-on-one engagement with someone. There's a level of intimacy and vulnerability that you can't replicate in other formats. And at the same time, I mean, I see comments in the chat where board committee participation is up. And that's something we've seen as a theme, where participation in board meetings, participation in committee meetings, you're seeing almost 100%. Part of it is because we can't go anywhere. And so we are a captive audience. However, how does this technology enable us to keep those numbers higher once things come back to normal? While running virtual programs, we are reaching people far beyond the usual catchment area. Yeah, it sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier around when we have snowbird populations, or when we have people moving around the country, or people moving around the region. We're not bound by geography. We're not bound by neighborhoods. We're not bound by, I live 45 minutes away from the central gathering point of the community, I can't participate. This does create, it doesn't replicate, it's not a replacement for individual engagement, but it does create an opportunity for people who may not live within our core catchment area. Any other questions? And just Heather and Jody know this. If there are questions you have offline that you'd like further exploration on, or a one-on-one Zoom or phone call, I'm happy to do that. Heather or Jody, you have my permission to share my contact information with anybody on this Zoom call. I'd love to be a resource. Hartford is one of the communities that I work with on an ongoing basis as part of my work at JFNA, not just in the plan giving side, but more broadly defined in the Federation. So if I can be a resource to people in the community who are still working through some of this, it would be my pleasure to do so.
Thank you, Dirk. And Lisa, do you want to kind of bring us home?
Sure. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lisa Fishman, and I'm the vice chair with Alan Parker for the Jewish Leadership Academy. So first, I want to thank all of you for participating today. And I know I took quite a few notes, and I hope that all of you have learned a little something in addition to what probably you've already known. And a special thank you to Dirk. We really appreciate it. You had come to our community in the past, and so we're so well received that we were glad that you were able to come back again, although in a different format, as you have been talking about. I also wanted to thank Jody and Heather. They have been working tirelessly along with the staff of the Federation and the Foundation. So I am most appreciative to everyone there. And I just wanted to say thank you. I wish I had some words of wisdom, but I just trying to keep my head up just like everybody else. So I just want to say thank you. There will be an email with an online survey, and we hope that all of you will fill it out, and we can move forward, and we'll be doing this again. So thank you.
Thank you. There's also a link to the email, to the survey in the chat, and there's also a link to an amazing article that Alan shared with us earlier that I really urge you to watch about leadership. It's a watch, actually. So it was a fantastic article. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Alan, and thanks to all of you who've been on the chat.
Thank you. Heather, feel better.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk.
Bye.
Is that a board meeting?
Jody, you wanna, is
Sure.
Jody still on? You wanna stay on?
Sure.
Hey, Cheryl.
You're muted, Cheryl.
No.
There you go. Now I got you.
I just want to say thanks for sending me that link. I was getting
I
paired.
don't know what happened. I'm sorry, because I thought I sent the same link to staff as I sent
No.
the people who RSVP'd, but obviously I didn't.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Meeting. Leave meeting.
Other time to respond to kids, but not my time.
Just give me a second, Ben. Give me-
All right. You're muted still. Okay.
Okay,
Oh, wait.